Mental Life, Conversations in Psychoanalysis. Conveying psychoanalytical thought simply. Welcome. My name is Nuno Sousa Monteiro. I'm a member of the Portuguese Psychoanalytical Society and work in psychoanalysis and psychotherapy in private practice in Lisbon. And I'm your host. In today's episode, I'm with my colleague and dear friend, Dr. Pedro, who is a clinical psychologist, also a member of the Portuguese Psychoanalytical Society, and works in psychoanalysis and psychotherapy in private practice in Lisbon. Our guest is Dr. Lee Grossman. He's a training and supervising analyst at the San Francisco Center for Psychoanalysis. He's also a member of the editorial board of the Journal of the American Psychoanalytical Association, having been part of the editorial board of the Psychoanalytic Quarterly for 15 years. Last year, he published the book, The Psychoanalytic Encounter and the Misuse of Theory. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Grossman, for accepting our invitation to join us today.
I'm honored. Thank you.
As you know, in a previous episode of this podcast, me and Pedro engaged in a brief discussion of your wonderful book. And it's now really interesting for us to be able to address you directly. We prepared a few questions, but we would love to engage in a fluid conversation with you.
Let me just start by also thanking you for joining us and for being available to talk to us. We really had a lot of fun actually talking about your book. I gather that you're retired now.
That's right.
From at least doing clinical psychoanalytic work.
Right.
Have you felt any changes because of that in yourself?
Oh, God. I thought I was ready for it. It's turned out, I've now been retired for almost 5 years, so I'm used to it now. But the first couple of years, I was frantically busy, I think, in an effort to hang on to my analytic identity. And in fact, I actually wrote the book after retiring.
Oh, okay.
I also wrote 4 plays, 4 short stories, a handful of essays, and bolstered up my photography website, which is probably my main activity these days. I miss it. I miss clinical work a lot, although I also felt and continue to feel a tremendous sense of relief about being free of the tensions that come with it. So it's a mixed bag, as I think retirement is for anybody.
Okay. Doing clinical work is still something that has a lot of enigmas and riddles for us. So it's still very important for us to listen to seasoned analysts and to people that are more experienced than us.
Well, I'm as seasoned as they come. In fact, you could hardly taste the original me.
How come?
Well, because of all that seasoning.
Okay.
By the way, I should mention from listening to your earlier podcast about my book that I think the two of you have a slight misconception about American psychoanalysis, as at least the impression you left me with is that you thought it was pretty homogeneous. And it's not. Everything is represented. Several different models are represented. There's plenty of tensions between the different institutes and different approaches. So at this point, I would say there really isn't a characteristic American psychoanalysis.
Oh,
Okay. You've talked extensively about how theories and techniques have a close relationship with the analyst's character.
Yeah.
But with that in mind, what do you think about the current models of psychoanalytic training? Would you do anything different? Do you have a position about that?
I have what, when I was a kid, would have been called the liberal position politically, which was also the out of power position. That is to say, I'm very critical of the way analysis is taught, and I have no good ideas about how to fix it.
so it's doomed.
I don't know about that. We've seemed to have gotten by despite my pessimism for many years. So, I do think analytic training, I think there've got to be a lot of different ways, all of which work for some people and don't work for others. And it's hard to generalize, but I do think that, at least from what I see over here, analytic training emphasizes theory over clinical practice, which is probably because it's easier to teach theory than it is to teach clinical work. But also, at least in my institute and in several others that I've had contact with, there's a tendency to emphasize something we might call clinical theory over clinical practice as well, where, at least in the classwork, there's an effort to teach some kind of analytic technique with a capital T, in a way that I think does violence to the whole nature of clinical psychoanalysis, because it misses the individuality of it. It misses the fact that what we're trying to do clinically is learn how to use ourselves. And so who we are matters tremendously. Even so-called relational institutes, I think, have that, run into that same difficulty. It's as if they try to teach being an individual, which you can't do. There's so much energy geared toward fulfilling the requirement, and there's a systematic necessity to define the requirement, not in terms of the personal, irreproducible interaction with the patient, but rather something that you can standardize to some degree. As I say, I don't have a solution to that. I don't know what to substitute for that. I do think in the Eidingen model, the so-called tripartite model, classroom work and case write-ups ought to be third most important among the three parts. And it ought to be so by quite a distance. I think what I like about the French model by comparison is the emphasis on one's personal analysis comes first. And that makes that much, as I say, I don't know the ins and outs, but that much of it makes tremendous sense to me. And I'd say after that, supervision is tremendously important, because in your own analysis, what you learn about is your own unconscious and how it interacts with the world. What you don't learn in your own analysis is that not everybody's unconscious is the same as yours. Yeah. So that's what you need supervised casework for, I think, more than anything else, is you have to encounter in a deep and personal way what the unconscious life of others who aren't you. But if you force me to make a choice between the Eidingen model and the French model, I'd probably choose the French model.
That's very interesting for us. We also tend to have our own, critical judgment about it. I just think that when you enter training, you tend to be aligned with your analyst and or supervisors in like a political sense, I mean. And so developing your own identity might be part of training too.
Oh, absolutely. And I can see where that's a problem that I hadn't considered. Although I think, in a way, going through training, you have to have somebody that you look up to, somebody that you think has the answers. And, it's a part of training to get to a point where you can give that up. At some point, you stop being idealizing anybody, including your own work. One of the worst things that can happen to you in training is you can write a book before you finish your training. Then you become an authority. And once you're an authority, you have a trademark. You have a vested copyrighted interest in a point of view. And once you've got that, it's really hard to learn anything different.
Because thinking is harder, right?
Yeah, and one of the reasons why I don't feel like I have a solution to this, I haven't come up with the Grossman model yet, is that you have to learn what we do by doing it. When a patient comes to see you, they're there because they need help, and you have to provide the help. So you're always kind of thrown into the deep water as soon as you start a case, and that's why I think a lot of how we learn to be analysts is kind of backfilling after the fact. You have to jump in, you have to do it, and somewhere along the line in the course of doing it, you have to figure out what it is you're doing.
Because that's scary. One tends to cling to theory and to certain bits of technique that have been proved successful, or one thinks so, right?
Rules that work statistically,
yeah.
but you don't know if they're going to work in a given case.
Yeah.
If you're going to see a patient tomorrow, you're going to need something to hang your hat on.
Well, it reminds me of a quote that you wrote on your book from Arnold Goldberg. How do you know when you are wrong? I think that's a great question. And how do you know when you are wrong? What would you say now?
I'd say analysis is an ongoing recursive process. You're wrong a lot if by wrong you mean, your tentative formulation proves false, or, a hunch you have doesn't pan out, or something you were absolutely certain of suddenly blows up in your face. I think, we're wrong most of the time in that sense, because everything we're doing is a process of discovery, and hopefully in a good treatment, mutual discovery, where the goal isn't to know everything in advance. The goal is to do the shared work that's required to discover things and to learn together. One of my favorite lines from my good friend Warren Poland was that we must always remember that the patient is understandable, not already understood. Then you learn from your patient, and your patient learns from your humility and from your openness to that approach of not knowing but discovering, and the acceptance of the fact that human beings are human, and so that every awful thing you can think about among humans exists in all of us. You set a tone for doing the work, which it doesn't eliminate the anxiety by any means, but it makes it a whole lot more bearable.
Well, wouldn't you say it limits in the sense of something that becomes thinkable in itself can lower the anxiety?
Oh, absolutely. Once you get there.
Yeah.
But eliminate the anxiety, it means reach a point where you can bear the anxiety, or some of the anxiety. The sickest patients we see are the ones that look the least anxious, generally speaking. The ones that in my formulation, I talk about them as perverse, but you also hear them described as borderline or narcissistic or various other words. But one of the key things clinically you see with such people is that they seem to have the conviction that no anxiety is bearable, that any anxiety is potentially fatal. And so, to put it in a different idiom, they don't have such a thing as signal anxiety. They don't have the capacity yet to use their hint of anxiety as a sign either to inhibit things neurotically or at least to back off from something that that's putting them in danger. And because of that, not only do they get in trouble psychologically, they get in trouble socially. They don't get themselves out of danger. But so, I mean, I think the analytic situation is inherently an anxious one. I don't mean every minute, but at some point or another, if there's anything happening that's going to be at all useful, you're going to run up against not only the patient having to bear anxiety, but you're having to bear anxiety. That's another reason why I think it's a good idea that you should have a bunch of analysis before you start training. In the United States, until the 80s at least, when the American Psychoanalytic Association was sued by psychologists, you had to be an MD to be an analyst, to apply for analytic training. So almost all of the analysts in training were psychiatrists first. Yeah. But in the early days, right after the war, psychiatric training, it was quite psychoanalytically oriented. Mm-hmm. And now it's the opposite. Now you don't get any therapy training as a psychiatrist. And so the psychiatrists that we get as candidates, particularly if they're just out of training, have less clinical experience than any other discipline. And those people, are really thrown into deep water. And the things they tend to cling to are the things that are least analytic, medication, management,
In 2019, I was in San Francisco, and one of the main purposes I had was to learn a bit about relational psychoanalysis. And what I found was that with instructors, they were very surprised. Like, you come from Europe. Why are you so interested in relational psychoanalysis? I had that reaction a lot. Why relational psychoanalysis? Why are you so interested in it? I was at SFCP and at Pink too.
Pink also. There's certainly a little bit more relational representation at Pink than there is at SFCP. Though the difference between the two is fading rapidly. But I think, there are as many different, at least in the US, there are as many different approaches as there are people. So
I don't think there's all that difference. Different schools, different angles, different approaches in general. Of course, differences in technique. But for instance, the call for the authenticity regarding error doing, regarding uncertainty. These days, the kids' term negative capability is everywhere. Like I think it's clearly in your book, the unknown things that are going on in the consulting room. This idea of an anti-vignette that's in your book. I think it's very interesting. On page 107, you write, that anti-vignette would encompass the volume of clinical material that does not get reported because we never understand it. Would you accept the idea that maybe the most important aspects, communications that happen in the consulting room are not those expressed by words, but unconscious ideas and thoughts that pass through other means?
Yeah, I think I would agree with that emphatically. Over here, there would be an argument as to whether that part of the process was analytic, in quotes, or not.
But what do you think?
It's certainly the bulk of what's going on, I think, is nonverbal. But on the other hand, I think the goal of an analysis isn't to know everything. It's to know something helpful. It's to get a grip on who you are in the world and in some useful way. Sometimes I think the conversations we have in analysis have almost nothing to do with what we actually say, but everything to do with what tone we're expressing, what kind of interest we're showing, what kind of willingness to struggle we're demonstrating. Edgar Levinson once said in a version of this that the content of an interpretation doesn't matter. That when you make an interpretation, you're conveying a sense that what's been going on is understandable.
Yeah.
And that even if my understanding of it is wrong, the very act of struggling to understand it puts the patient's experience in a new context, in a useful context.
What would you say about how does one uses one's unconscious while doing analytic work?
Well, how does one not? But I think maybe the implication to your question might be more along the lines of how does one learn to trust one's unconscious in clinical work? That to me is the main goal of an analyst being analyzed. Not to know his unconscious exactly, not to render it all conscious by any means. That just doesn't happen. But to learn to at least begrudgingly trust it so that you don't ignore your own association. Now, I think that can be overdone. And I think if you read some of the Kleinian literature, in theory, they overstate their ability to distinguish their own unconscious from what's the patient's unconscious. And so you get this particular narrow reading of projective identification, which says something like, whatever I experience in the consulting room, the patient is putting it there. You start attributing your own unconscious thoughts to the patient, and that puts a pressure on the patient, probably one that the patient experienced in childhood from a parent. I'm talking about Kleinian theory. I'm not talking about any particular Kleinian's way of working.
When I read your book initially, I had this feeling that the way that you handled, your own, I would say, countertransference or the presence of your unconscious was using humor. And I love that. It can't be always easy to do that.
Well, thank you for that comment. I really value that. There's a line from Lawrence Durrell. He said at some point, as a young man, I set out to be a genius, but mercifully, laughter intervened. I think it's tremendously powerful. It's a funny thing about me, and I've always had a relationship to comedy and humor. And I wasn't kidding when I said in the introduction that my biggest regret is not having done stand-up comedy. As it happens, when I sat with patients, more often than not, associations would occur to me that turned into interpretations. And the associations, when they occurred, they would take the form of either a joke or an old New Yorker magazine cartoon. You're right. There's something about the humor that provides just enough safe distance from the heat of the fire.
Yes.
That makes it possible to face anything. The same things interested me in photography as interest me in analysis, which is to say, what's hidden or what's expressed, what's hidden in plain sight. I do think that art and humor and psychoanalysis all share, I suppose you could also add Zen meditation, an effort to simultaneously appreciate the holism of one's experience. I think it's of great prognostic value when you discover your patient has a sense of humor.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
It's a really bad sign if they don't.
Yeah. And the same goes to analysts, don't you think?
Yeah, I do think.
Well, yeah.
But we're both too polite to say that.
Well,
so,
but it's an important asset, so to speak, but it's a genuine and natural one. I think it stems from curiosity and the ability to ask questions and to be really passionately interested in things in life. I think humor stems from that in a way.
I think that's a very interesting addendum to Freud's book on jokes. Actually, it's boring as hell. I don't know if you ever tried to read it, but
well, I agree with you. It's not. It's a bit boring, yeah.
Not where you go for laughs.
No, definitely not.
I was just thinking there are patients that can use dark humor in a humorous way. I even think that might have like this seductive movement, around it, trying to make the analyst laugh or something like that.
Oh, yeah.
But there are moments, especially with very depressed patients, when they kind of attack themselves, I can't laugh. And this is actually interesting because the same patient that might be able to make me laugh, and even out loud, might say something that comes in a different tone. And you sense that and you can feel that. It's not humorous anymore.
Right.
Mm.
Right. With respect to the first kind of people you were talking about who use humor seductively, I think my first experience with that was a patient who made some sadistic joke, and I responded by saying, "Ha ha," in just that tone. And it brought him up short, and it made him hear what the content of his joke was. And the form of his presentation was, if he could get me to laugh, somehow I would be complicit in the sadistic wish, and he wouldn't have to notice that, that was happening.
Well, I was thinking in the humor. It's something not only that one couldn't teach at any institute, but again, it's very unorthodox.
There is one American analyst, Michael Bader, who talks about that as a bonus. I tell jokes with my patients, but I don't advocate telling jokes with my patients. I just do it because I can't control myself. My own use of humor is it's more the way ideas occur to me, not what I say, but what I think. Sometimes a New Yorker cartoon will occur to me, and sometimes I'll describe the cartoon to the patient, particularly if I don't know why it occurred to me. I don't object to humor, but I don't object to anything.
Sometimes I have this experience. I'm going to say something, convey an interpretation, but I don't know how it will end. So it's as I'm beginning to speak, I'm also beginning to think about it, and so it's something that develops, unravels.
Yeah, no, I agree with you on this one, rather than your teachers. I'm much more inclined to think out loud with a patient before I know what's going on. It's hard work that we do. Mechanics aren't asked to work on the car while they're driving it.
Yeah.
And again, tolerating not knowing what the result will be.
Right, absolutely. For the most part, you're bringing things up because you're interested. You're interested in the patient. That's not your only motivation, but it's a big one. And if you trust that it's there, then you don't have to worry too much about, suggesting something to the patient.
Another passage of your book about the non-interpretive way of influence patients, where you write, page 93, the question for analysts is not whether to influence patients in non-interpretive ways, but how best to be aware of those influences and put them to good analytic use. I think this is a very interesting idea because it has to do with what we were exactly talking about, but almost pinpointing it to clinical usage. It takes a lot of courage addressing clinical work in this way.
It does take a lot of courage. It's not an unusual amount of courage for an analyst. I mean, it's a requirement in being an analyst.
It's an uncomfortable position, not just for junior analysts. And I think your book shows it, that it's not just analysts in training have that issue. It travels along the psychoanalytic spectrum.
Oh, it does. And it comes and goes, even for experienced analysts. There are times when our courage fails us.
Okay.
And we realize, that we've been sailing along for some time, kind of coasting and not really engaging.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we have to cut ourselves a lot of slack in that regard. And on the one hand, we work toward giving our best all the time. On the other hand, we better not condemn ourselves too strongly for our inevitable failures.
I do think that something that also stems from your book is the notion that doing this work is something that is aspirational all the time. You aspire to be able to do the work well or well enough, but also there are moments where you're actually saying, look, this is unteachable. You can't teach psychoanalysis.
You can't teach the characterological requirements, the prerequisites for psychoanalysis. But if you can select those people, then you can teach them. But yeah, you're right. I mean, you certainly can't teach it the way you would teach how to do a mattress suture. I actually have been working with a colleague who's a former student. His name is Louis Roussel, and he's writing a book on teaching Freud. He's been the main Freud teacher at our institute now for many years.
Mm-hmm.
My exchanges with him have this same quality. The main thing we're trying to get across, even in reading a text like Freud's, is that everything is still open. Everything is still up for discussion and for thought and for reconsideration. And that context is everything. Context changes the meaning.
Well, like in a session.
Yeah.
Because we go back, we rethink, reposition ourselves and the patient, but the context is always changing in some ways.
Even if the context is a memory. There's an American analyst named Kay Blacker who wrote an article, an exercise he did with medical students on their psychiatry rotations. He had an analysis, and there was a particular memory that came up early in the analysis about the family playing Chinese checkers together. And this memory came up 10 different times in the analysis from beginning to end. And he excerpted the text of these memories, took them out of context, and put one memory report on separate cards on each card, shuffled up the cards, and passed them out to the medical students and said, put them in the order in which they came up in the analysis. Now, these were students who had no experience with psychotherapy or psychoanalysis. And none of them had any trouble whatsoever putting them in order, because what happened was they changed from straightforward black and white caricatures to more and more nuance and more complexity as time went on in the analysis.
Like it's sometimes nice to see developing throughout an analytic process.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Dr. Grossman, it was great to have you in this conversation. The opportunity to talk with you about such interesting subjects, your wonderful book, and your psychoanalytical thinking. So I'd like to thank you dearly again for having accepted our invitation to join us.
Well, you're very welcome. I had a terrific time. I really enjoyed talking to you too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mental Life. Conversations in Psychoanalysis.